today I wanted to talk about how it's terribly how the migratory nations and peoples are terribly represented in EU5. And I wanted to use AI to come up with a better solution than just this stupid one location can only be held or occupied by one settled nation account. This isn't historically accurate. This isn't represented in previous games in this way either. In Europa Universalis 4, you had migratory nations, if I'm not mistaken. No. Let me think. Europa Universalis 4, we had migratory. No, I am completely lost on the EU4, even though I have over 10,000 hours in the game. But whatever, this thing I'm going to actually wanna share with you. This idea is that a location in the EU5 should be allowed to be occupied by a settled and a migratory nation at the same time. First of all, to better explain this, let's take a location first. Bursa is a location that is represented by about 70% Orthodox, Romaniote, and Greek peoples, but 30% of this location is Turkish, and it's the capital of the Ottomans. Most of what Ottomans hold in 1337 is Greek. This land here, excluding a couple of provinces, is Greek. And these are settled people. But historically, the 30% you see here, the Turkish peoples, most likely was not a settled Turkish people. In other words, to represent Turkish people in this location, demography, I would not represent them as peasants. Maybe a couple of thousand peasants were living in Bursa, yes. But most of this most of this 13,000 Turkish people were most likely migratory Turkish people, as in they lived in yurts, in yurts. How do you translate yurts? I don't know, but maybe I could use translate for you. You could call them tents, but the word yurt at the same time. One of them is a tent, and the other one is a group that the migratory people lived in. For example, let's say a couple thousand people lived with their clan in tents near the countryside. Most of this 13,000 Turkish people would probably live in tents near the countryside. And being a migratory tribe, being able to migrate, for example, from Bursa to Bilecik, and from even within Bursa to other locations. Well, this is a single location, but understand what I'm saying. They'd be migrating within and outside of Bursa. So representing them as a settled people who live in Bursa is a terrible mistake. And on top of that, representing them as a people who live under the tag of the Ottomans is another big mistake. What do I mean by that? This is a settled country, and it is true, Ottomans were a settled country in 1337. But one thing is misrepresented within the Ottoman lands. That is the Ottoman Turkish people who lived under the Ottoman sovereignty had their own beys, had their own tribal lords. What do I mean by that? For example, a migratory tribe living in Ankara wanted to do holy war against the Byzantines because the Ottomans were fighting the Byzantines. And the Sunni Turkish people living in Ankara, with their bey, with their tribal lord, decided that they wanted to join the holy war against the Byzantines. They would migrate from Ankara, for example, to the Ottoman lands. And they would make a deal with the Ottoman bey at the time, which is Sultan Orhan. The Ottoman Sultan, Gazi Bey, would grant them grazing lands to the migratory Turkic people, would grant them grazing lands, for example, let's say Einegor, and this migratory tribe would provide the Ottoman Sultan a couple thousand, maybe at most, but 400, 500 tribal horsemen, as in they are represented in the army-based countries, 800 cavalry of horse archers or horsemen, whatever. And those 400 tribal warriors would join the Ottoman Sultan in that war, in that holy war against the Byzantines. But more often than not, these tribal people would migrate as an entire youth, which means as an entire tribal people, as in they had a bey overlord, which was the tribe's chieftain, and this migratory tribe was basically their own tag, their own nation. Even though they were not very many people, let's say a couple of thousand or 4,000 to 5,000 people living in tents. Most of them were children, elderly, women who were not fighters, but let's say 4,000 to 5,000 people living in Chubuk, Ankara, Haymana, wherever, in a single location. For example, a couple of acres, they would live here, and then they would migrate to, let's say, here with the agreement of the Sultan. Grazing lands were granted to them, and out of that 5,000 people, 400 tribal warriors would join the army in a battle. This is not represented in Europe EU5. So what I suggest is exactly that. Introduce migratory tags, not just within Anatolia or steppes of the Pontic lands, the entire Eurasia should be represented by them. What do I mean? Here you see the Golden Horde, and here you see Ruthenian, Moldavian, Hungarian peoples. You do not see a single representation of the steppe people, migratory people, whether Turkic or not, whether Sunni or not. They would have representation in these lands historically. Hungarian people are settled migratory people. They are settled in this land a millennia, I don't know. I don't know exactly when. 1,000 years before this, for example, let's say. I know I'm mistaken, but assume it is. They became a settled people, yes, and now they have very little representation of the migratory tribes that they used to have. But in the, for example, fringes of the Pontic steppe and in the fringes of the Kazani and Ryazani lands here, you would be seeing a lot of steppe tribal peoples, and within the Golden Horde as well, and throughout Persia and the Middle East, you need to be able to see all of those migratory tribes who haven't decided that they wanted to be their own sovereign nations. They are living under a sovereign, most likely as a vassal, but sometimes even as independent, and other times even having their own vassals but not have been settled themselves. So what the game needs is that representation in the game. For example, the Sultanate of Delhi. I wouldn't expect to see much representation of tribal tribal migratory people, steppe people in these lands, but at least in the fringes, in the Punjabi lands, and in other places as well, the scattered representation of these tribal warriors should be present. Otherwise, whenever the Sultanate of Delhi collapses, or whenever the beyliks here collapse, 100% of the time, when you make them release a nation, for example, you conquered all of this land, and you decided you want to release the Karasids from the conquered land, yeah, as a historical tag, or as any tag, historical or custom. The tag that is being released as a vassal is 100% of the time Greek and Orthodox, because the majority here is Greek and Orthodox. But the reality of the situation is that when the Sultanate of Rome, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, collapsed, the scattered migratory tribes that occupied these lands under the name of the Karasid Bey, under the name of the Ottoman Bey, Osman Bey, and the Germian Bey, and the Hamid Bey, they decided to settle down. Migratory tribes, they decided to settle down and take control of the land itself. It was a decision that they made to be their own sovereign in the land. But had they not taken that decision, they would have stayed a migratory tribe, possibly perhaps migrated back into a deep corner of the Anatolia with their tents and all. They would have migrated back, staying as a settled migratory tag. But they didn't, and they decided they wanted to actually settle these lands. So that. And yeah. I will continue this with minutes.